Recorded live.
Hello and welcome to the Virtualization Security Podcast, Roundtable episode number 65. We are going to be talking to Mitre about their new security frameworks. Our panelists, as always, are Eben Rodriguez, who consults with enterprises to assist them secure and operate their virtual environments. Eben is currently not available on the phone, but he is listening in. We'll be making comments via myself and or our guest. Michael Berman is the CTO of Catbird, the pioneer and industry leader in security and compliance for virtual environments. Michael will be joining us later. Our best wishes to Hema Prafuchandra, who is also one of our standard panelists that could not make it today due to medical reasons. And, of course, myself, Edward Halecki, a.k.a. TechSciWill in the VMware Communities Forum and author of the book, VMware vSphere and Virtual Infrastructure Security, Securing the Virtual Environment, which is available on Amazon. I've written several books on virtualization, and that is just one of them. Our podcasts are equalized by Tim Pearson, a contributing author for the VMware vSphere and Virtual Infrastructure Security book, and owner of Data Century, Inc. Our special guest panelist this week is Robert A. Martin, who is a principal engineer at Mitre. So, Bob, why don't you tell us what you do at Mitre and the new stuff you have that came out recently?
Thank you. Well, as a basic focus, I've been trying to help our customers, which are the federal agencies in the U.S., although one of them is the Department of Homeland Security. So from there, we basically try to help most of the commercial industries in the country get better at security. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is our efforts in standardizing the discussion about software application security. Basically, those problems that make your software vulnerable to attack. If it's a commercial piece of software and it's found, they'll try to get an advisory out so you can patch it. But those same kinds of problems happen in everyone's software because we basically haven't learned how our software can become susceptible to attackers. So the thing I've mostly focused on for, about the last 5 years has been the common weakness enumeration. And the purpose of that is to get in front of everyone a collection of these issues in architecture, design, coding, or in deployment that can lead to your system being vulnerable at the application level.
So common weakness, and you're looking at purely as it's a tool effectively for developers.
Developers and maybe acquirers. So if you're acquiring software, you may want to be familiar with the different ways it can be fragile and vulnerable to attack.
Now, are any of the hypervisors been put into this format yet, or anything about them? I know there's plenty of CVEs, of common vulnerabilities,
right,
about all the hypervisors out there, but how would that translate into CWE, where I'm looking for the common weaknesses?
Well, basically, the CVEs happened because of CWEs.
Okay.
So, CVE is a specific instance of a mistake that got out into the shipping product. But what went wrong, either in the design or the architecture or the coding itself, or maybe even the deployment, is a weakness. And so, many, many people can have the same problem with memory management or permissions. But when it happens in a specific product, that's when a CVE gets assigned.
Okay, so if I was, looking to buy a hypervisor or to upgrade all my hypervisors, I would possibly research the CWEs to find out what the common weaknesses are so that I could plan my environment security.
Right. And also you may want to look at it to understand which of those weaknesses actually would be more damaging given that kind of application or whatever you want to build on top of it.
So what weaknesses are we talking about here?
Well, there's the classical buffer overflow or SQL injection flaws or command injection or, those are, I guess, the more well-known. There's, web level, cross-site request forgery, which are much harder to exploit, and therefore, they're not as commonly known because, only the things that get exploited get in the press, as it were.
Okay. So as far as we know, there haven't really been any of these types of exploits against hypervisors.
Against hypervisors, I wouldn't expect to find any web level type.
Well, they all have web interfaces, so they could be.
They could.
For example, do you have the CWE for what SMUCON picked up? That if you have a open VMware hypervisor, if the server is open, you could actually get the disks.
Probably, but not off the top of my head.
Okay.
It's all out there, by the way. It's a publicly available resource.
And what is the link for that?
It's cwe.mitre.org.
Okay.
You can get that on HTTP or HTTPS.
I think the big use with this would be for something called platform as a service environments, where I'm the developer, I'm working in this, and as I'm working with Java or Grails or Ruby or a database or whatnot, I may want to look up in CWE and CVE those particular developed programs, tools.
Right.
And make use of them and see, hey, is there anything in these that I should be worried about so I can code around them or choose another product?
That's a definite way to use these. And another way is through figuring out what kinds of failure modes you are totally intolerant of. In other words, if I had a weakness in my code and that actually manifested in the final product that I, put into operation, if somebody exploited it and the outcome was the ability to read data, depending on what that application is doing, that may not be a problem or it could be a really bad problem. So if you know what your application's doing and what it's doing for your enterprise or for your customer, then thinking about these different failure modes would let you focus in on the weaknesses that lead to those failure modes, and then that way you can prioritize rather than just sit there and try to deal with all 800 plus CWEs that are cataloged.
So there's only 800.
Right. It's not as many as CVEs. There's over 66,000, I believe, of those.
Okay. So, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of I can look at the failure modes. So how would I measure or be able to determine the failure modes in my own software?
Well,
if I'm developing something like on OpenShift or Cloud Foundry, I may want to put something together to try to figure out, hey, do I have a weakness that I put in?
Right.
The chances of me finding in 800 just CWEs that Java has a problem that's specific to my need is probably impossible.
Right. You need to focus on your code, and because there's all these different ways of going wrong, and most, if not all, developers weren't taught about these as they were learning how to develop, it's, we're all coming into this in after we got set in our ways, as it were. So if you think about your application, and this is actually one of the things we just rolled out last month, is this scoring system. The idea that of all those 800 weaknesses, they really come down to the technical impact. So if they actually manifest in your system, what is the impact if somebody exploits them? And it comes down to just 8 specific impacts. So modifying data, reading data, unreliable execution, resource consumption, executing unauthorized codes and commands, gaining privileges or assuming identity, bypassing protection mechanisms, and hiding activities. Those 8. So if you can think about how those 8 fit within, kind of your danger scale for what your software is trying to do, then, and rate those. So, if it's really, really bad, give it a 10. If it's bad but not as serious, maybe a 6. And if you don't really care about it, maybe a 1. Those are the, kind of the scale for those impacts. And if you go into CWE, you can tell which CWEs lead to those impacts. Now, any one of the CWEs may lead to more than one of those impacts, but the idea here is you can now go and say, okay, any CWE that has that modified data, and that's the worst thing that can happen given what my application is doing, all those CWEs are the ones you're going to want to focus on. They're the ones you're going to want to learn about and understand how maybe a design choice will let you, avoid them, or maybe you need to run a static analysis tool on your code, or maybe you need to understand how to test for them. So that's the idea here is, rather than try to face all 800 plus, you really want to focus on those that are going to damage you in important ways, given what your application is doing for your organization.
So it's all based on what the business is doing.
Right, which is a radical departure from most security practitioners.
So if I have my business is, for example, my business is writing code, I'd be interested in using this to make sure that my business doesn't suffer, but to know what the common mistakes could be.
Right.
But even if I knew what the common mistakes could be, let's just take one of them, cross-site scripting. Will the CWE tell me how to fix that?
It will. In fact, that's one of the things that we really spend a lot of energy on. There's a very large set of mitigation advice. If you go out, you'll find that the mitigation actually tracks to different phases of the development life cycle. And the reason for that is so that, if you've already shipped it and it's out in operation, well, maybe there is something you can do to mitigate it. Change a permission on a directory or something. Or maybe you're going to have to do something in the code. Or maybe the only solution is in the architecture, which is going to be a long fix time. But the idea is to get those all in front of you so that you can see the different points where you could mitigate and address the problem.
Okay. Well, that sounds great if I'm in the know of security. As if I'm not in the know. I'm a lowly programmer or lowly developer in a company. I barely know how my program will be used in the end.
Well, then I think you're probably.
You got to remember, here's the problem with development today, and this is why Cloud Foundry and OpenShift cost, and even Azure costs quite a bit of concern for security people, is that we have gone from a situation where it took, took the average amount of assembly language that was written in any 1 year was about 500 lines. C code, 2,500 to 3,000. Depending on who you were, it could be even more, twice that. C++, a little bit more than that. Now you get to PHP, Java, Grails. Even more is being written in a very short period of time. Or less is being written, but using more libraries or more shared resources. So we're actually building new applications that people want out the next day instead of actually going through a real development cycle.
Yep.
We've moved from really doing a development cycle to rapid prototyping, say, yep, it works, now ship it.
Well, and that's one of the thrusts of our work in this area is to get it into the tooling. And when I talk about tooling, I'm not talking about standalone, static analysis that some test department runs. I'm talking about getting it integrated into the IDE environments that people use. So
well, if they just use a command line, or if they're using OpenShift and
well, then they're going to have to be the auditor of themselves. And that's why up on CWE we also have code examples. So we show you the bad constructs and the good constructs. Our goal is to have examples in what I call each language family. In other words, we can't do it in every single language, but if we can do it in one that, if you know this language or read this language, the one you work in is a close cousin, and you'll recognize, the story we're trying to tell.
Okay.
Of course,
so I guess okay. Well, let's take a step further. And you have another tool out there that's new, right? A risk assessment.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at with the different danger modes. Basically, that scoring system that we came up with, it's really something that we've been working up to for about 4 or 5 years, where we started out back in the first time it became kind of public was the top 25, CWE SANS top 25 in 2009, which we worked with the community, about 40 different organizations, about 50 different people, and came up with what are the most dangerous of all these different types of weaknesses. We had developers, we had tool vendors, we had researchers, we had people from government, all across the spectrum. And that got a lot of attention, but the real reason we were doing it was to figure out, how do we tell when one weakness is more dangerous than another? What are the factors? And we learned a lot that year. And then in 2010, we did it again, but this time we asked people to help us figure out how often weaknesses happen in real code. And then we did a cross-product with that set of data against how bad it is when it happens, how dangerous. So in the second year, we actually had a sorted list. This year, we added in another factor, which is how hard is it to exploit the issue, or how easy, depending on which way you want to come at it. And so you'll see the list is a little different because some things, while very dangerous and they happen a lot, are really, really hard to actually exploit. Whereas there's some other things that you can automate, in fact, the attack. So that whole learning curve with the community is what also became the input to our scoring system. So the Common Weakness Scoring System, CWSS, is out there as one manifestation of that. The Common Risk Analysis Framework, we call it CRAF, I guess a silent W, is another manifestation of that same scoring system. One, CWSS, is meant for tool vendors. So if you go, buy a tool or have a tool used for you as a service, you'd love that tool to report back the mistakes in a way that reflected your priorities and what that software was meant to do. And you'd like it be consistent across different vendors of tools. So that's where CWSS is aimed. The CRAF is aimed at, okay, I've got a development group. They're building certain kinds of applications. And those applications work in certain business contexts. So what kinds of weaknesses are more important for that group to make sure aren't in the product, and prioritize that so I can make sure they have the right training, they have the right tools, the right test environment, and maybe if I'm outsourcing, I have the right terms and conditions in my contracts.
But how often do you find that companies actually have good test environments that are doing these rapid web development?
Well, that's a good question.
I mean, how many of them follow good practices like, oh, we're going to develop, we're going to test it, then we're going to pass it off to QA, and then we're going to pass it off to
production.
To the production when all that is done. You know, people were expecting that to take one day, all of it.
Yep, and
develop the code, test it, put it out there today.
The ones
we've done, our development cycles have shrunk so much that we don't have time to do good QA.
Well, I don't think you have time not to do it, because all you're going to do is
I
end up...
understand that, but you're saying business-based. Business says, rush, 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 we'll deal with the consequences later.
Well, that's the same people that pollute and, foul our environment, and now, guess what?
Yeah, but they're the ones paying the check, paying the bills. So the developers are going to do what they need to do. So what ends up happening is if you don't slow down, and this is why the hypervisor vendors take so long between releases.
Oh, yeah.
Because they have to do this. They have to do good QA, because if they mess up, they'll be out of business.
Well, in fact, one of the things that was extremely gratifying was when we released the top 25, each time, we basically had expected uptake in the technical trades journals, but in fact, it was overwhelmingly the business media and the general, USA Today type media that picked up the message. And so there's hope that, the message may get through. And, you're right, if people don't put a priority on it, then you can't inject that from below. Of course, every single developer can also try to be the best at the job within the time they have available. And so that, kind of, organic grounds-up capability is also supported by what we're doing. We're trying to get it into training, trying to get it into education, try to get it into tools so that even if it's not mandated, it's still possible.
So if I was to take the CW, the risk assessment tool, what are you calling that again?
The CRAF, Common Weakness Risk Analysis Framework.
The CRAF.
Yeah, silent W.
Okay.
Because I didn't know how to pronounce it with a W.
Should just call it craft. Okay, so with craft, can that be applied to anything besides standard software? Like, for example, could I apply it to determining which platform as a service vendor to choose? Could I apply that to determine the risk involved with doing something in the cloud?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's a pretty young framework, so exactly how you can use it in those kinds of situations isn't, black and white sitting there.
Well, give us an example of what's in there.
Okay, well, if you go out to the website, as much as we have is there. What you can look at is,
Again, that's www.mitre.org. You can search for it there.
Right, or go to cwe.mitre.org, and it's on the left menu as CRAF. So, it basically talks about customizing CRAF, because the bottom line is it's what your environment, what your business, what you're trying to do. You'll see a lot of discussion on the website about business domains and also about technology groups. Think of those as navigation posts. Any group is going to need some examples to look at to learn about this. So the idea here is if I'm using web technology and I'm doing it in online banking, you can look in the online banking domain and the technology group, and eventually you'll be able to click and you'll see some examples.
Okay.
Not that you're going to go use that, but this is a starting point for you.
What about something like evaluating something like Salesforce or Google Apps or Dropbox?
Well, you're not going to be able to, examine them because their code isn't sitting there. But you can think about what they're doing for you and what kinds of mistakes and failures would be the worst given what you're asking it to do for you. And so that would then let you go talk to Salesforce or the others and say, gee, I'm depending on you to do this. And so what have you done to address these kinds of failure modes? What kind of assurance can you give me that I can rely on you not to have mistakes in this area?
So effectively these frameworks become, how do I think about the problems that could happen?
Right. That matter.
It's kind of like the first steps to, hey, if I'm going to determine if I want to go with a vendor, I can look at this list and say, okay, what's important to me from a business perspective? That translates to the technical, and I can go from there and ask the questions. Right.
I mean, today or yesterday maybe, you'd basically say, well, what have you done against, HIPAA or FSMA or 853? So generic that even if they tell you, do you understand what it means to you? Whereas here, it's kind of the same framework, but it's focusing down on the part of it that matters, given what that software is going to do for you.
Okay. So Michael Berman just joined us. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
So what we've been talking about, just to bring Michael briefly up to speed, is how to take CWE and the framework that developed it and apply it to bigger things. Like, for example, if I'm going to go and interrogate a SaaS provider about their services, I need to know what I'm thinking about first, so I could use these frameworks as a guide to give me that. If I'm a security guy, or even if I'm not. So that's what we're at. We've been talking a little bit about it.
Hey, Ed.
Yep.
This is Even.
A lot of noise, Even.
Yeah, I know. I have a quick question on what you were just talking about. Why can't the vendors like Dropbox and others evaluate themselves with that and publish the results? Do we see that happening?
It's actually one of the things we hope will happen. I quite often talk about the framework and CWE itself as enabling a discussion about assurance activities. Now that you have a vocabulary of terms and concepts and a framework that are consistent, you can, make statements about what I did, what I didn't do, where I've put my resources that will actually make sense to more than the person you're talking to. So that third hand, that, arm's length assurance information is now going to be useful, where before, it really wasn't possible for them to do anything and explain it in a way that others actually understood what they meant.
Right. And I'm curious about how far we are away from having that data available. Might there be a database of vendors that have done this for their services that is available either to the public or to prospective clients, and where might we find that information?
Well, we haven't gotten there yet. This actually gets into things well beyond CWE and this risk assessment framework, because now you're talking about how do I gain assurance and confidence in somebody else's work without being the one looking through the work. And if you think about that, a lot of effort has gone over that in many years, and it's always a private discussion. So now we're trying to say, well, what is in that discussion? And one of them, the efforts to solve this is basically, how do you argue an assurance case? It's that term, assurance case, is one that came out of the safety world, but it can be argued for security or reliability or any feature you're trying to gain confidence is really there. But basically you ask people to make a claim and then eventually argue about, here's some evidence that supports that claim. And then, of course, you have to see if that's a reasonable statement. Does this kind of evidence from this kind of source actually convince me that that claim may be true? But for instance, a trivial example, SQL injection flaws. I make a claim that my system is not susceptible to SQL injection, and then the evidence to support that could be you ran static analysis tools and found that all of the use of SQL was parameterized and no user input goes directly to the database. So then you could, put that together and somebody could, see it and have some confidence at least on that aspect.
But you got to remember,
sure.
Even there's another problem we have, and that is that we're not even getting this data in cloud audit very often. So perhaps CWE in the risk assessment should be put as another domain to cloudaudit.org in what they're doing, so that we can get everything out as a common location. Because until that happens, it's, again, disparate information.
Yep.
They may not actually put it out there because, hey, it may mean that we're weak, which, that could be the case. They're not, a company's not going to do that. I just don't see them, unless it's legislated or part of compliance, to say, hey, this is where our software is weak.
Well, it could become a competitive tool if you do have all your ducks in a row and you're very mature. Can't even think of a company that might, but say you were, this would be a great thing to say, hey, we ran this and here's our report. And we encourage all our competitors to do the same, and then they might not want to.
Right, but what you may get is a accredited third party making a statement on behalf of the vendor.
Yeah.
So, because think about your food label on your box, how many fats and triglycerides and calories and so on. Well, think of those as, contaminants or features that you want. So I sometimes have started talking about software as water. Depending on what you're going to use the water for, you care less or more about certain kinds of contaminants. It used to be we had lead pipes. Guess what? We didn't care about lead back then. Now we know we should. Well, we didn't care about cross-site scripting errors. Now everything's on the web. Maybe, we should. So if you think about these weaknesses as, pathogens or bioproducts or lead or, other elements and minerals that you don't want in your software, in your water, depending on what you're using it for. If it needs to be potable, certain things shouldn't be there. If it's just used for cooling, the other things are okay. If you're using it for irrigation, you don't want salmonella issues. So depending on how well we think our tools are at finding, or our processes at finding these contaminants, then evidence that they were used and they got a clean bill of health, is all you need to accredit. So we're not there, but I think it's about the only way out of the mess we're in, because everybody depends on everybody else, and nobody has the time to go investigate all the people they depend upon.
Right, and there's two avenues to get this, right? So using your analogy, which I like, this is Michael, hi. You have the Clean Water Act, which is a legislative approach. And then you also have the market. And in the market, the approach would be something like a service level agreement. When I travel internationally, I have a service level agreement with the hotels I stay in effectively, right? I go, depending on my sensitivity to the water and where I'm going, I go to hotels that have, expensive water filtration systems built in, so that I know when I brush my teeth or, drink a cup of water from the tap in my hotel room, I'm not going to get sick.
Right. And of course, some of the places I go for scuba diving, they tell you not to use the tap water.
Exactly. But you're also paying less for that hotel room than for the hotel room where you can't drink the water, right? I mean,
yep.
We have that experience. So I'm just saying there's a market-driven way to do this, and I think that service level agreements, and I think the providers that can give that level of service, i.e. can give you that clean a water, that secure a website, or that secure a storage infrastructure, or that secure a software as a service, will probably have to charge more because, they're going to have not just security technology, which, I would claim now is not so expensive, but they have to have the processes in place and the training in place.
Right, and that's where I think now there is a ISO standard now, 15026, about assurance cases, and there are beginning to be tooling standards on how to model that. So the idea here is you don't want a verbose English document that you have to wade through to understand what they're claiming and how they're backing it up. You want something that's real easy to, look at and say, yep, I'm good with that. And so not only do we need to know that the right things were looked for and that tools that are capable of finding them were used, but we also have to be able to navigate through that claim and that evidence quickly.
Well, and that's where a third party is handy, because then a third party can have that expertise to do that for you.
Yep.
Right, whereas the average consumer, right, I mean, living as I do in California, I don't have the expertise to know that my city is giving me clean water, but I know that my city tests for that and that other people test my city's water, and they know how to do that.
Right, and given the supply chain of software, we don't know where software comes from. It could come from anywhere. And the next version, it could come from different places. So if we don't have the ability to check and know that the right things are being checked for, we would be forced to tracking that bottle of water from the moment it's bottled all the way back to our refrigerator, which is actually the way some people are approaching supply chain risks. They want to know exactly where it was bottled, and they want to know it wasn't tampered with all the way through, which is probably not scalable.
Okay. Doesn't that get us to the point of is that going to actually be possible with software today? Given how many components make up a simple application that's done in, let's say, platform as a service. I know my platform came from, let's say, VMware, or it came from Red Hat. However, because it's open source, all the little bits came from everywhere else.
Right. So
and tracking it back is going to be tracking it back to the guy that wrote the 5 lines of code inside of...
Well, and that's why you don't want to track it back. You just want to be able to know that you had the right kinds of, measurements done to know it doesn't have the contaminants you care about. You shouldn't have to track it all the way back, and that's the part that's unscalable.
Okay.
So along with that, what third parties are currently able to provide this sort of reporting and auditing?
Well, no, let's not get in front of ourselves. This is what we're trying to establish, and this is, what we're putting in place, as it were, and we and putting are strong words. This is what the community seems to be finding as a viable approach, and who would the appropriate labs be? One end of the spectrum would be the labs that they use for things like common criteria. I mean, they definitely have processes and they're documented and they're out there, but they're pretty big animals.
They're also very closed about what is the problem. If someone did not make CC one of the common criterias or did, they still won't tell you why or what didn't pass or what comments. They'll just say, it has this rating.
Right.
And that's not really useful to me because I don't know what happened.
Yep.
Why it got that rating, not another one.
Well, and on top of that, you don't even know that they what they looked for. And so we're actually working with them to put the common weakness enumeration and its partner, the common attack pattern enumeration, into the fabric of doing common criteria evaluations. Because, okay, which contaminants do I care about? Well, that paradigm falls apart if we want to really think about it. It's what attacks do I really worry about? And, well, most of us can't figure out what attacks are possible. So the common attack pattern enumeration is just collecting all the publicly known types of attacks so that you can have them there as a library, so that you can understand whether the right things were addressed when I'm thinking about, how my software needs to be resilient to those attacks. And that's a whole nother discussion. It's the kind of yang to CWE's yin. The two of them complement each other and point at each other. In fact, if you go in the CWE site, most of the items have pointers to the attack patterns that are effective at exploiting those weaknesses. So I think we're right in the middle of a lot of change, and a lot of promising things are opening up that will, get us away from security as a feature, as a lock on the door, as a, it's encrypted, it's secure, and rather what kinds of attacks is my software resilient to, what kinds of weaknesses and contaminants have been addressed, how do I know that they've been addressed, and how do I, how can I gain trust in that? I think there's going to be an interesting marketplace shift. David Rice likes to talk about it, the market of lemons, where you can't tell a good car from a bad car, therefore you don't want to pay for a good car because you can't tell which one it is. Same thing in software. But through these changes, I think we're going to start to see you can discern between something that's had some discipline and has the evidence to back it up and those that don't.
And I have a follow-up question to the vendor issue. What companies are able to use your product? Sounds like they're getting there. They're not there yet. But are there any software companies that are possibly integrating your system into their products?
Yes. In fact, two different groups or perspectives on that. If you go up to the CWE website, you'll see an area called compatibility or compatible. And we started that as a place where tool or service suppliers or educators that were using CWE in their tools or in their offerings could, let people know that they were doing that. Well, there's 3 organizations up there that don't provide a service or a security tool or education and training. They're up there because their internal processes and activities of developing software uses CWE, and they've publicly declared that. And that's
awesome.
EMC Corporation, Symantec, and Apple. Now, on top of that, you can look at SafeCode. They're a consortium of large software vendors, Microsoft, Juniper, Nokia, EMC, and a couple others. They actually give out advice on secure software development practices that they feel as a group work and have, help, well, from their perspective, probably help avoid unscheduled patch cycles. But basically, they heavily highlight CWE and talk about KPEC as part of test coverage. So we're getting traction, but we're definitely not done. I want to see this into training, education, certifications of if we end up that way in software security, it basically needs to be part of the fabric, wherever appropriate, I guess.
Okay.
If we have a company that does software programming, what would be the best way for them to get started to integrate this into their process? Where would they start? Is there a getting started guide? Or
yeah, well,
have a call with somebody?
There's a lot of material up on the CWE site, and a lot of the items, they actually have code examples and pretty good discussion about what the issue is. And, when you get into an issue, quite often looking at the attack patterns against that issue is a very useful thing. Because if you just describe a weakness, sometimes it's hard to understand how it can be a problem. But if you walk through how somebody would attack that weakness, you start to understand the interplay of user input and processes and, going after resources and so on. So that's a very useful way of looking at it. But the real focus is, well, which ones do I start looking at first? And that's where the top 25, CWE SANS top 25 list was meant to help people, find a starting place. And then this year with the risk framework, it would let an organization even focus more tightly on the kinds of failure modes most important given what their developers are building and what that software is meant to do and in the context of that software. So if it's handling credit cards data, obviously they're going to end up having to live under PCI, and therefore anything that leads to disclosure of credit card data would be really bad. Whereas maybe a denial of service, resource consumption type of failure, yeah, okay, they can't, do the transaction right this second. That's bad, but not as bad as, somebody's credit card data getting stolen. So I think both of those are going to help people dive into this. Plus, there's some education and training offers up on the CWE compatible list too. Companies that are and organizations that are offering training.
Awesome. All right, thank you. I'll check that out.
All right. So this is so I'm going to ask you a vendor question because.
Well, you're a vendor.
I'm a vendor. But it may be a benefit to anybody else in the audience who's got the same sort of situation. So I'm a security vendor. I'm already participating in, various security content automation protocol areas. So I've got my CVE compatibility. I've got Oval. I'm doing, ongoing work with XCCDF. Building up that whole framework for full SCAP certification. So I see CWE here. I don't think you're part of security content automation. You're an offshoot.
Well, we're an earlier phase. So security automation contents, SCAP, is really aimed at the operational configuration and vulnerability patch, area.
And the integration of diverse tools so that we can all exchange information with each other, right?
Right. But there's a lot of other security activities going on in the enterprise. There's events on the wire. There's intrusions. There's new development and ongoing development. So you'll see other areas of automation, and CWE is part of that software assurance automation, and it's also really part of how you describe attacks. So if you go to the Mitre is definitely very involved in all of those areas, and we have a website called Making Security Measurable.
Right.
And
it's a great site.
Well, thank you. I manage that effort. So yeah, in my time when I'm not working on software and attacks, I worry about automation of the whole enterprise, and we're hoping that all these pieces are coming together. Why do I care about a vulnerability? Well, because it lets somebody do something. Well, how do I avoid it next version? Well, what went wrong? Well, that's where CWE comes in. And so the two, play together, but at a different place in the life cycle of the systems and the components of the systems.
Right. And then the specific sort of vendor question I was going to ask, right, I'm a security vendor. It's in my interest to write secure code and to productize and ship, software that has a high level of integrity. So I follow, many different processes to do that. Is this something you see as a good housekeeping type labeling? So, if I were to go through this program and I would put like a CWE brand, not that anybody ships a box of software anymore, but a CWE brand on my site to indicate that I follow a high integrity process for my coding environment. Is that?
Yeah, that's the kind of things we're trying to inspire. And what you're going to find is, at least in the government, they're going to start asking that you use CWE and the attack pattern work as part of the machinery of validating and verifying that your software does what it's supposed to do and nothing more.
Right.
And we already have in the new guidance that went out to all DoD programs called their Protection Profile Plan, I think it is. It basically asks people to address, what have they done to address CWE and KPEC in the whole development of their project, and that same kind of concern is going on within DHS and the other parts of the federal government. And I think a lot of large enterprises realize that, I can verify that a piece of software does its functionality, but if it's made of brittle code that, is attackable, then how do I know it's ever going to do its intended functionality, whether that's a business function or a security protect function?
Right. Now, that's a very interesting point that I'm looking for, because I occasionally get asked this question, as a security software vendor who sells to the federal government, we have this thing called EAL, right?
Common criteria.
Exactly. So, which is an incredibly arbitrary and painful and expensive process, and totally unsuitable to the software industry as it stands today.
So
and,
I suggest you become knowledgeable about a ISO technical report that's almost finished. It's called ISO Technical Report 20004, 2004.
I'm familiar with that series.
Well,
sounds very familiar to me.
Yeah, well, it's basically a report that walks you through how to evaluate under common criteria, but instead of a paragraph about threat, you think about what attack patterns your threat could practice, and then you do a little bit of analysis of that to figure out which ones are appropriate given what your capability, your product does. And then you look at the CWEs that those attack patterns are effective against, and there's where you start your assurance case. You can have
but the reason why I find common criteria to be so unsuitable is ignoring the expense is that the problem in the software industry of today, and even in my business, right, I follow a development model that's very rapid, right, and we're all
common criteria isn't.
Well, we're all virtualization security people, and so I'll just use VMware as the example, right? They came out with ESX3. They went through EAL4, I think 4+. They then came out with ESX4. Basically had to do it all over again, more or less. Have just barely, I think, just recently gotten their 4 certification, within the last few months.
Yep.
And they are now shipping ESX5.
Well, and that's the reason why I was talking about the assurance case.
Right.
And I talked about tools to model an assurance case. It's actually called a structured assurance case, and how you make your claims and you basically argue about how evidence shows that you fulfilled them. Well, if this is now in an analyzable model, then when you bring a new version in, you can populate, the evidence. You have the same structured argument, possibly, and the whole idea is to allow this to happen real quick.
Well, this is my point. In my build system, I try to have automated tests. So I have unit tests built in.
Right,
so
and you could do it against
code. Right, they're running through these tests.
Right, and those tests could now include tests on weaknesses and attack patterns that are misuse and abuse test cases, and all of that would be evidence that you could bring to bear in a structured assurance case. And so we're trying to get the whole common criteria to be this more specific and easier, quicker to run type of process. But
right, because it has to be part of every version. That's the other thing that's so funky about this, right? So, if let's say I release version 5 next week, right?
Yep.
And I have to go through my EAL, and I do that. But when I come out with 5.01, and that's marketing, right?
Yep.
I can call it 501 even if I've replaced half the code. I shouldn't, but I could.
Yep.
And I don't have to go through EAL again for such a minor release version number. And we all know that really, even if I just change 2 lines of code, I may have introduced one of these critical weaknesses.
Well, even if you changed the compiler you compiled it under and it has a different library.
That's right.
Yep. No, and that's, but they can't crank through that whole process the way it's set up now.
Not feasible unless we automate it in a structured way.
And that's where we're trying to bring them, but it's not an overnight thing.
No.
Well, guys, this is now we're in the close of our hour. So, any last thoughts about this, Bob? Do you have any?
Mine is that we're at the start of something that can really be exciting and really get something useful happening in the whole assurance space. And we're looking for everyone's help. So if you find issues that we're not addressing, contribute.
Okay. Michael?
I am going to get involved. This is yet another 3-letter thing from Mitre that I did not know about, but I'm going to get involved. I am not calm about it, right? What's the right word? I mean, I think this is a really hard problem. I'm trying to solve it in my own microcosm here at Catbird, but we're really talking about supply chain integrity for software, and we already know how hard that is to do for hardware. So I do think this is a great direction, especially in the sense that we can try to automate this and make it part of our development process.
Okay.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, my last thoughts is that I think this actually needs to be baked into the PaaS environments, the platform as a service. I would love to see Mitre work with OpenShift and VMware. I mean, Red Hat and VMware to pull this type of information directly into it, as well as work with Eclipse. Perhaps a sensor or something that allow you to bring up, oh, you're writing a web app. These are the things you need to think about. But I also think that we need to use platform as a service environments carefully. We can't just willy-nilly write code and shove it in production because it quote-unquote displays the right stuff. If you don't know what's doing under the covers, or it can't test what's doing under the covers, it could be doing some really, really bad things. And these tools will help us get there, I think. I'm looking forward to seeing more about it. So, Bob, thank you very much for joining us. I know it's been a long time. We started this conversation, a couple years ago?
Yeah.
To get you on the podcast.
It was just yesterday, right?
Yeah, something like that. And as always, thank you, everybody, for joining us, Eben and Michael for joining us today. And everybody that's listening, we will be back in 2 weeks. Have a good day.
Thank you.